Hi everyone, my name is Klaudia and I'm here today to talk about finding real connection in those small everyday moments. So in a world that's more connected than ever, do you still find yourself feeling alone sometime? Well, I recently had a situation where I was searching for connection in a place that wasn't yet my home, where I didn't speak the language, and frankly, I didn't fully understand myself. But first, let's go back in time. So from a very young age, I was always the kid who wanted to do more than expected. I wanted to shine brighter. In fact, when I was younger, I had a dream of living abroad and doing things like I am today. So I would say teenage me would be pretty proud. I was born in a small town in Poland, and then I grew up in Scotland. So having first moved abroad at a very young age, I consistently found myself looking for ways to fit in. And being the only foreign kid in class was not always tough, as you can imagine. And now last year, I had one of those moments of, I want more. And now, at the time, I was in a really good job, I lived in London, I could travel anywhere I wanted. In fact, my job was remote, so I could actually work from anywhere I wanted. So if you looked at me from the outside, that probably looked like a pretty good setup, like I was living a good life, right? But on the inside, I wasn't happy, and I didn't know why. So work was often stressful, and somewhere along the way, I'd lost my spark. I was burned out. And in fact, I'm not alone in this. Turns out there's many people like me who feel the same way. To put it to perspective, 68% of Gen Z and 61% of millennials feel like they need to change their job or their lifestyle altogether due to burnout. And that's a pretty big shift. So naturally, in that moment where I was feeling burned out and frankly not so great about myself, my mind wandered to the place where I was last happy. Japan? What if I moved there? Now, yes, I know, pretty cliche. You've probably seen many TikToks and Reels about people visiting those beautiful places and thinking to themselves, should I move here? And yes, I actually did that. One thing led to another, and we packed up our lives and we moved across the world to Japan. How cool, right? But you know, once I arrived, the adventure I'd imagined felt different. I wasn't looking for novelty. It was something else. I just didn't know what yet. Now, the first few weeks in Japan were pretty tough. Just like with any move, it's a lot to take in. Add to that the jet lag, distance from anything familiar, and you get a pretty interesting potion. Everything was new. The culture, the language, the systems. In fact, I remember one of the first weeks in Japan walking to a local supermarket, and I couldn't read any of the labels. So actually, I stood there frozen, overwhelmed and kind of useless. I took out my Google Translate and I started scanning all of the labels just to see what was what. My internet wasn't working. At that point, I was hungry and frustrated. And what should have been a 5-minute errand turned into this 30-minute painful ordeal for me. At that moment, I realized that even the simplest things don't feel simple when you're disconnected. It was also one of those moments where culture shock hit me pretty hard, and I thought to myself, I want to find a way to fit in and connect with my surroundings. But I also knew that kind of connection doesn't just happen overnight. So let's define a few things first. What does it actually mean to feel connected? If we look at an emotional definition, it would be something like to be seen, to be heard, and understood by others. It's a sense of mutual presence. And loneliness goes hand in hand with the feeling of being connected because it's a subjective feeling of being alone, even when you're surrounded by people. So it's not about being physically isolated, but about the feeling of disconnection. And that can be pretty tough. So the first few weeks in Japan, I remember telling myself, I'm going to vlog my journey and then I'll become an influencer. It'll be super fun. So I posted beautiful pictures of cherry blossoms, me walking around with a coffee in hand, smiling, videos talking about how great it is to be in Japan and how much I like it here. But you know, it was one of those Instagram versus reality moments. Because I looked like I was thriving and having the best time. But on the inside, I felt so lonely. In fact, I didn't know who to call because all of my friends and family were on the other side of the world, probably still sleeping. So it looked like I was connected, but it was just an illusion because I'd never felt more alone. Now it's funny, we live in a hyper-connected world. We're surrounded by social media, messages, constant updates. In fact, it can be overwhelming. Yet connection doesn't always mean closeness. In fact, 1 in 4 adults worldwide, that's 24%, feel like they're very lonely often. And that's kind of loneliness that's difficult to explain because everything looks fine from the outside. So what I've come to learn is that real growth comes from the places in between, even though it can be pretty scary. In the places where you don't quite belong, but you push yourself and you stay anyway. For example, I've always liked going to Pilates and yoga classes. And for months after moving to Japan, I would tell myself, I'm going to go to a class. And I know it sounds simple, but I kept finding excuses. Every time I would go on the website, the booking systems would be complicated, would overwhelm me, and I would just give up. But eventually, I went to a studio nearby, and I signed up for a class. And you know what? I didn't understand every word, and I wasn't the most graceful. But I showed up. I met a new friend, and I even learned a few new words in Japanese. And it felt like a shift, as small as it seems. It was a shift in the right direction. So what I'm trying to say is that growth doesn't always have to be this big breakthrough. Sometimes it can just be showing up, even when your whole body wants to shrink back. So this kind of thing brings me closer to home. And I now go regularly to those classes, and I even have a new friend. So win-win. Speaking of home, with my friends and family being so far away, I felt like I needed to find a community for myself here. And so I began volunteering at a startup conference in Tokyo. And it felt so good, you know? Connecting people and ideas. And I always felt like I was pretty natural at making connections with people. So just like that, by taking the step to volunteer, I met entrepreneurs, dreamers, doers, people who, like me, were building their lives in an unfamiliar place. And it was so comforting to find that resonance. That reminded me that connection isn't about geography. It's about resonance. Because in a city of millions, I finally found people who mirrored parts of me, and that felt really good. Now, if you quickly close your eyes and ask yourself, who are you when nobody's watching? You can open your eyes back up. You know, living abroad stripped away so many of the labels I thought defined me. The planner, the organized one, the one that always has to be in control. Because when you move abroad, it's like you start all over again. No one truly knows you or your background. And in that blank space, I ended up asking myself, who am I really? And the funny thing is, there was no clear answer. Instead, it kept shifting. And that used to scare me, because I was the organized one. But now I see it as freedom, because pushing myself outside the comfort zone has become a big practice of growth for myself. Now, we often treat life like this checklist, that you should graduate, marry, succeed, find your people, as if there is this final destination where everything just clicks. But what if There is no perfect landing, no single place where everything just clicks into place, where you just arrive and you have your happily ever after. What if the real journey is to stop asking yourself, where do I belong? And instead start asking, how can I belong to myself right now? I used to think that once I checked all of the items on the list, then I would feel settled. But arrival, I've learned, isn't a place. Instead, it's a mindset. And it's one that you have to keep choosing. So this story, my story, is still unfolding. There is no perfect ending. But I've stopped chasing the idea of home as a place, and instead started creating it for small daily choices. So every so often, I go to the same coffee shop, where the owner doesn't speak English, and I don't speak much Japanese. But we smile, and she knows my favorite coffee now. Now to me, that's home now. This is a connection. It's not always big, but it's real, and that's enough. So this is my collection of imperfect moments that shaped me recently, and maybe a quiet invitation to you, to give yourself permission to wander, to feel out of place and stay. Because when you start showing up for yourself, you make it easier for others to do so. And so if there's one thing that I would like you to take away from today, don't be afraid to go out there and find yourself. Thank you so much.